Thanks everybody for joining us this morning. We are excited and look forward to presenting this open forum on risks that keep nonprofit leaders up at night. So we hope you find some great takeaways in this session. And again, this is an open forum, so please feel free to ask questions, provide thoughts throughout the presentation so that we can make this conversational and valuable to everybody. And just some quick introductions before we get things started. So my name is Justin Krentz. I am the principal in charge of business development here at Vertilocity. And with me, I have Dan Sefik. Dan is the principal and national director of HBK's nonprofit solutions group. And for those of you unaware of the relationship, right? So Vertilocity, we are an HBK company. So we work very closely with each other to help solve client problems in different capacities. So Dan and his team, on the accounting and compliance side of the house, and then Vertilocity on the IT and security side of things. So again, just some quick updates here, right? We want this to be valuable to everybody, to you and your specific problems, your specific organization. So please ask questions, share experiences so that we can make sure you're getting the most out of the next hour as possible. And with that, I will turn things over to Dan and we can get things started.
All right. Thanks, Justin. I appreciate it. And thank you all for being with us here today. We're excited to talk about some of the things that are going on in the nonprofit industry right now. I was actually joking with someone earlier that I was doing a webinar about what keeps nonprofit leaders up at night. And they said, how did you come up with only 6 areas? Because just over the last year or so, I mean, it's been a crazy environment for sure. It's there's a lot going on, and just nonprofits in general. There's just a lot of challenges with how you're set up and just the environment that we operate in. So just kind of wanted to preface it with that. But as Justin said, I would love for this to be an open forum and for it to be conversational. So please, by all means, let's share our experiences here and try to have everybody take something away that can add a little bit of value to your specific organization. So with that, just to kind of kick things off a little bit, we have a poll question. What's your biggest challenge right now? So we have six options here. Pick the one that probably is your biggest challenge. You may have more than one, but is it federal funding or grant uncertainty, financial reporting audits, or any sort of regulatory filing pressures, staffing and turnover in finance or operations, board governance and oversight, cybersecurity and technology risks, or just cash flow and reserve concerns? So if you want to drop your answer to the poll there, I think that will provide us some insight on where to go next as far as the conversation goes.
Yeah, and we can use the Q&A and chat feature. So I'll monitor those, and so if you want to put your information in there, that would be wonderful.
Very good. I think the interesting thing to point out about this is, oftentimes these issues don't necessarily live in silos. So you could have a staffing issue that leads to an internal control issue, which then could lead to an audit issue. Your funding uncertainty, if that's an issue for your organization, that sometimes can lead directly towards cash flow stress. Cybersecurity, then that's definitely something now that we've seen, especially in the last couple of years, that boards are really asking about just from a risk perspective. And in my day job, I'm an auditor, and audits are getting harder. I will say that that's not because auditors are mean, even though I've heard that a few times. I think the environment is just becoming increasingly more complex. So, if anybody would be willing to share the answer that they picked, we could start there. Okay, so David, thanks for dropping that into the chat. So staffing with the 69% turnover rate, staffing is definitely a challenge, especially in this environment. We've seen that we work with about 600 nonprofits across the country, and I would say staffing is probably one of the biggest and most legitimate challenges that nonprofits are facing right now. So you are not alone. grant uncertainty and staffing in a rural area, definitely challenging. We've seen that, an uptick in that as well. Especially with the remote environment, I feel like it can be a good and a bad thing. You have, in some senses, you have more options, but then your potential pool also has more options that they could, potentially move jobs a little bit easier than maybe in the past. But if you require more of an in-person presence, because you're serving, a type of population that needs those services in a more in-person type environment, definitely can be challenging. And we all know nonprofits, we have constraints with our budgets as well, so that kind of plays hand in hand with that.
And then Alicia dropped in cybersecurity and technology risks.
Absolutely. I mean, that's definitely one that's growing. That one keeps me up at night, and I'm not a nonprofit leader. The schemes have gotten more sophisticated. Technology is evolving at a very rapid clip. So yeah, it's certainly a very valid concern there.
And I share in the same sentiment, Alicia. Just looking at everything through a technology lens, right? Cybersecurity is always the item that keeps me up at night.
Absolutely. If anybody has anything else that you want to share, I mean, you can certainly drop that in the chat, but Justin, you can go ahead and advance the slide there. Thank you. So 6 issues that we're seeing consistently across the nonprofit space. I'd say the first one, federal funding changes and uniform guidance pressure. If anybody followed the news, especially in 2025, there was a lot of conversation. There's a lot of delays. There was outright cuts as far as federal funding goes, and that had a huge impact across the industry. That one, especially for if your organization is structured that receives a lot of these grants or really depends on these grants, it caused a lot of stress, and it definitely caused a lot of operational issues as well. And kind of more down that stretch is the uniform guidance pressure. So if you have a single audit, the compliance supplement, I've been doing this now for about 15 years, and that compliance supplement, I believe it's close to 2,400 pages at this point. So as you can imagine, the supplement itself is complex. It keeps evolving. Documentation expectations are going up. Grant agreements are getting tighter and tighter. Reimbursement can be slower, especially in 2025, where they outright either were paused or stopped. And it's tough for program staff to keep up with those, and just the continued demands from that. So it's really from something that I've seen, even from over the last, I would say, 4 to 5 years, as finance teams are now really chasing paperwork that, quite frankly, didn't exist a couple of years ago. So definitely a lot of challenges in that space. As we talked about staffing shortages, weakening internal controls, that's an area certainly that's presenting some challenges. I feel like nonprofits in general, we kind of operate on a razor thin margin to begin with as far as staffing goes. So any sort of shortages or turnover, I feel like it disproportionately impacts a nonprofit. So that's definitely something that we're seeing out there. Cybersecurity becoming a board level risk. I would say probably 5 years ago, and Justin, you can chime in on this one as well. Cybersecurity was more thought of as just an IT issue, where now it regularly comes up in board meetings. Boards are really concerned just because of heightened risks around cybersecurity. So what
Yeah,
we've
absolutely.
seen,
And Dan, just to kind of expand on that, right? Board members, are visible in the community, right? You're typically, listed on websites. Board members are involved in other organizations, right? So they are prominent figures in the area or in the industry, right? So their information is going to be readily available. The attackers, know that those are the individuals that are kind of the most critical to the organization and decision makers. So they will specifically target, right? To your point around becoming more sophisticated, they will do their research. They will look on LinkedIn. They'll see who you're connected with. They'll try to leverage public knowledge at this point to gain access, right? So it's no longer a, hey, the Saudi prince, wants me to, sign up so he can send me $10 million that's stuck. Right now it's, oh, well, I see that you're connected to this individual and I'm going to be very strategic in how I present in an attempt to gain access. So yes, it's becoming much more, they're becoming much more intuitive. They're becoming much more focused. So cybersecurity is definitely a board level risk.
I mean, we've seen, like you said, the social engineering is definitely picked up. We've seen ransomware hits. We've seen phishing schemes targeting finance staff. There's some concerns about donor data being exposed. So now I feel like when I'm presenting the results of an audit, the board is asking as much about cybersecurity as they are as about the finances. It's they're asking, are we covered for any of these sort of things? IT or insurance carriers now are even asking about IT control. So I feel like the environment, it's definitely become much more front and centered for sure. The next one we're seeing across nonprofits, single audits requiring more and more documentation and oversight. Once again, it's not because auditors are difficult. I think expectations have just significantly changed. And even now, sadly, federal grants have become politicized. So there's just heightened scrutiny on those. So that's where a lot of this is coming from. Also, boards not fully understanding the organizational risk. I'd say this one is a bit fascinating. Boards, they review the financial statements, the audit gets presented, everybody feels pretty good about that, but sometimes there's some things that are beneath the surface that nobody's really talking about, where the real risk lies. So what I'm getting at here is the reserve level, your funding concentration, your fraud risk, your staffing risk. So an audit, it provides a lot of great information about your finances, but just because there's this kind of pervasive idea throughout the industry that if you have an audit, it equals lower risk, I would say that's not actually true. I think I think it's a great tool, but I think there's a lot more that kind of bubbles beneath the surface that needs to be addressed from a board level. And then finally, this one's probably no surprise as well, as the cash flow stress. Even with a seemingly healthy financial statement, you could have lots of revenue, you could have multiple sources, everything looks great from that perspective. But your cash flow, we've seen a lot of organizations that live week to week, and one change or one delay or pause in their structure could really have a pretty big impact on the way they run their organization. I would say this one, it confuses a lot of people, to be honest. On paper, everything looks great, but really, it can be very stressful if there's cash flow issues in your organization, even in a seemingly well-run organization. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the chaos in the federal funding environment and uniform guidance. Like we talked about, 2025 was a tumultuous year, I would say, for nonprofits. There's definitely there's a lot of changes going on in the federal funding arena. We're coming off a time period during the pandemic where there was a lot of COVID funds that were out there. Those have since dried up for the most part, and there's a lot of organizations that became dependent on those and are struggling to transition kind of in a post-COVID or post-pandemic environment with that different funding streams. So, and on the flip side, you do have some organizations that they continued a lot of these programs that they started during COVID, and where they used to manage maybe one or two major programs, they now manage upwards of 3 to 5. And that can present a lot of different challenges, because you have, if you had only one grant in the past and now you have 3, we're talking about triple the documentation, triple the testing, triple the questions. So we're seeing, just as inflation has rolled on, we're seeing more programs qualifying as major programs that $750,000 or going forward, it's going to be $1 million threshold that qualified for major programs. It doesn't take much to get there as far as grants go these days. So we've seen more and more becoming major. So that's definitely something that's out there that we're seeing. And as part of that, CIFA completeness and grant tracking challenges. That's a big issue we're seeing in the audit world right now. Not because anything is necessarily being done wrong. It's just grant tracking is very, very tricky because oftentimes it's happening to program departments on spreadsheets, sometimes outside of your system, sometimes in emails or places even that finance doesn't always see. So at year end, the finance departments, they're really challenged to try to reconstruct this picture of federal funding. And it can be very difficult because there's just a lot going on that's happening in other areas that they just don't have a day-to-day view on. So we've definitely seen that. One thing that we're really focused on from an audit perspective is just really having the conversation. How do you know that you've actually captured everything from a completeness perspective? Because that could have a pretty major impact, especially if you rely on the federal funding. If the CIFA is inaccurate, could present some challenges as far as grants in the futures go from the federal government. So definitely an area of focus for us from the audit side. And then I would say too, especially in 2025, and we've seen that to some degree in 2026 so far, is just the reimbursement delays are certainly impacting nonprofit operations. So we're seeing, at the state level, at the government agency level, they're taking longer and longer to pay. And then we're seeing, they're requesting additional documentation before they even consider reimbursement. So what's going on here? You have organizations that are floating their payroll and operations, running these grant programs, but they're waiting for money to come to reimburse those. And it's creating stress on cash flow, on finances in general. I just feel like in general, it's really just putting a lot of pressure on finance teams and a lot of pressure on program teams as well, to really work together and to communicate in ways that they may not have had to in the past. So we've definitely seen that. It's been a pretty big challenge, I would say, throughout the industry. It's just the tightening up in this area. Is anybody on the call here? Have any of you all experienced funding delays this year? I'd be curious to know. So I'll share. We have an audit client here on the HBK side that we've worked with for a while, and they've historically they received one primary federal grant, and they had a relatively easy single audit process. Over about a 2 to 3 year period, they received several new funding streams tied to some expansion efforts and supplemental funding that they received. So from their leadership and their board perspective, it sounded, it was great news. More funding, more programs. They had a bigger impact. All great stuff. But operationally, the organization just really wasn't built for the compliance complexity that came with all that. So they really they faced some challenges there because different program managers were tracking the grants differently. Some of the reimbursements tracked on spreadsheets, some of it via email, some in the financial system, some were even coded consistently across departments. So at year end, finance, they believe they had all the information they needed for the CIFA, but during the audit, we identified some additional federal expenditures that initially weren't included because they flowed through a different department. So, suddenly the CIFA had to be revised. There was a new major program that wasn't planned for. There's an additional testing there, additional cost as well that went along with that. But really, from a complexity standpoint, it's it compressed the audit because there was still a deadline that needed to be made there. It made the whole process very difficult, even though no one really had intentionally done anything wrong. The organization, for lack of a better term, they just simply outgrew their compliance infrastructure faster than they realized. So it wasn't necessarily that their anything from a paperwork perspective was incorrect or wrong. It was just there needed to be a lot of tighter coordination between finance and program leadership as their funding increased.
Yeah, and Dan, we had some feedback come in. Heather mentioned that they only had a delay in a GEMA grant funded by FEMA, but that was a special security grant, so it didn't really affect operations. And then David had mentioned that West Virginia is late publishing grants.
Yeah, and that's certain. I mean, you get that on any given year, that you have budget delays can have impacts on this as well. We're seeing that in PA. We've seen that over time with the state budget. But yeah, I mean, I see also, Heather, thanks for sharing. You had a delay in your grant funded by FEMA. It was a special security grant, so it didn't affect operations. That's good to hear. It really depends, once again, on the structure of your organization. It could have a really large impact, or it's something that's more supplemental. It's a little easier to navigate. So thank you for sharing that. All right, so we'll dive a little bit deeper into cybersecurity's now financial statement risk. Like we talked about, the ransomware and phishing attacks are actively targeting nonprofit finance teams. I've heard that from numerous clients. It's definitely a thing that's out there. Nonprofits have a lot of data. It is something I think that people underestimate. You have all your donor information, you have payroll information, you have grant data. You, in some cases, can have PHI. You could have, lots of things depending on what your operations are really focused on. So that's definitely an area of risk there. You may have noticed during your audit, your auditors, they should be, if they're not, increasingly inquiring about IT controls. There's been a rise too of just an incorporation from an audit perspective of getting folks with an IT background as part of the finance audit, just to make sure that the auditors have a great understanding of these controls, and if we identify any potential holes or weaknesses, we can help the organization address those before they become bigger issues. Just because now these controls, they're embedded in your financial reporting process, your payroll processes, et cetera. So it's really important that you have a great handle on those, because it does now really directly impact your financial risk as well. And then you have boards asking about cyber insurance and response plans. These conversations are happening now, very regularly. And I would say, a lot of times organizations don't have a great answer to these, because it's still a relatively new thing as far as the proliferation of all these risks go. But it's definitely something that organizations should be talking about and should be actively planning for, as far as that goes. And it just, if there's a lack of a plan, I feel like it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And it's definitely something, back to the premise of the webinar here today, definitely keeps people up at night.
Yeah, Dan, and even to take it a step further with cyber insurance, right? In a lot of cases, the board's asking about cyber insurance, but then if you're going to pursue it, right, you've got to make sure that you've got your security stack, your technology in line, because the next thing that's going to happen is cyber insurance is going to want to do, a quote unquote audit, right? They want to validate that you have specific controls and security tools in place, because if they're going to, write a policy, they want to make sure that, those parameters are again in place. So we help a lot of organizations from that standpoint, make sure that their house is in order before they pursue the cyber insurance policies.
Absolutely. That's a good point there, Justin. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody on the webinar here today, are these conversations going on in your organization, or how often do you talk about cybersecurity and the risk that it potentially presents? While we're thinking about that, wanted to share just kind of an example of an organization that HBK has been working with. For most part, it seemed like they had a relatively normal finance process. They had a staff member receive an email that appeared to come from leadership requesting an ACH update for a vendor payment. Everything about the email looked legitimate, correct tone, signature was on point, formatting looked very normal. So the change was processed. So a couple of days later, the organization unfortunately realized that some of those funds were wired to a fraudulent account. And the part that was interesting wasn't just the financial loss. It was kind of everything that happened after. So now you have the board, they're obviously concerned, they're getting heavily involved. You have insurance carriers being contacted. You have questions about your internal controls, questions about staff training, questions about vendor verification. It just really opens an entire can of worms. And I mean, what they realized shouldn't come as a surprise. They didn't have a real cyber response plan in place. So, they kind of took the traditional stance like, oh, cybersecurity is just an IT issue. But, when incidents like this happened, it really affects everything: finance, governance, operations, insurance, all the way down the line, and reputation. I mean, these things aren't great from a reputational perspective as well. So, I think that's why there's been a good push to see some changes in these conversations. Um, I feel like 10 years ago was, do we have antivirus software? And now it's more questions are being framed. So what happens if our payroll is locked up for a week? What happens if our donor data is compromised? What happens if our accounting system's unavailable? So that's kind of just a little background of why some of these questions are being asked. But I think it's one of those things, really having that plan in place from a prevention perspective goes a long way.
And Dan, Heather had mentioned that her board has not inquired about cybersecurity.
I would recommend that. It's definitely something that's worthwhile to bring up, because it is a real issue that's out there, and I think to any degree that you can get ahead of that potential risk, I think you'll save a lot of headaches down the line for sure.
Yeah, and Dan, you mentioned earlier, just wanted to touch on, depending on the type of data, right, that your nonprofit has or is storing, right, there could be compliance framework that you have to adhere to, right? So if you have PHI, personal health information, right, or you've got credit card information that you're storing, or whatever it may be, that's sensitive data. There can be compliance, requirements around that. So you want to make sure that you're aligned, to that framework as well.
Absolutely. All right, we'll move on to staffing shortages, as we know that's a pretty big issue. Are staffing shortages are breaking internal controls? So what that looks like, from a staffing shortage perspective, you really have fewer staff handling more responsibilities, doing more with less, so to speak. Um, but I would say, staffing shortage probably traditionally was thought of more of an HR issue, where now it's really directly impacting, operations, internal controls, things of that nature. I can remember in the not so distant past, organizations that used to have a controller, an accountant, and a bookkeeper. Now they have one person trying to do all these roles. It's not necessarily because they want to do it that way or because they can't hire or even can't afford to. It's just it's just the situation that, how things have evolved. So another thing, obviously anytime you're losing staff or having a staff shortage, the lack of segregation of duties from an audit perspective. Most times internal controls are designed assuming at least a certain number of people. Usually means you have at least 2 to 3 people in a process. But when you're down to just one person, especially in a finance capacity, that control structure is really difficult, and it can't exist in the way it was probably designed originally or intended. So you really, what that means, a lot of organizations, unfortunately, they're just not really in compliance with best practices as far as the segregation of duties aspect go. And it's really just because they don't have a choice, unfortunately. And it's definitely something from a leadership perspective, that's certainly something that would keep me up at night as well. You're really putting a lot on one person, and you're relying on one person to do some pretty critical aspects of your business with some sensitive areas as well. So definitely something that's out there. another thing that staffing shortages are really harming is the reconciliation and reporting processes. Uh, we've seen, especially in the last couple of years here, it's normal for a bank reconciliation to be done within, typically 30 to 60 days in some instances, where now we're seeing them go months and months on end without being reconciled. We got credit card statements or grant tracking. These are all months and months behind, and it's not necessarily from a negligence perspective. It's really just it's an overload on one or a few people. And what that really breeds is an increased fraud and error risk. And that's where, the risk of, potential fraud or misstatements or mistakes really come in. And you're really inviting the opportunity for fraud just because that environment that was intended to have, you know, proper segregation of duties and controls just no longer exists. And it's a lot easier to commit fraud because nobody's looking over it, or it's being so delayed, or just, when you're looking at something months after the fact, it's easy to kind of brush something off as normal. So I mean, that's definitely something that we're seeing out there, and it's unfortunately impacting a lot of organizations. I know there was some concerns about turnover on the webinar here this morning. Has anybody else experienced, especially over time, kind of the reduction in staffing really kind of directly impacting um, segregation of duties, or anything as far from a responsibility perspective goes? While we're thinking about that, I have an example of a nonprofit that I've worked with a few years ago. That unfortunately they lost two of their finance team members within 6 months. So historically, they had a CFO level position, they had a accountant level position, and they had a bookkeeper underneath them as well. So after the turnover, they lost both their accountant and their bookkeeper. They essentially had one person who was carrying the entire finance department. And, at first leadership said, okay, it'll be okay. We'll get some people in here. It'll stabilize in a month or two. Um, but a lot of the things that we saw as part of this, and this showed up in the audit as well. The controller, CFO person, they just weren't able to get to a lot of their responsibilities that they really should have been getting to. So we had a bank reconciliation. In this instance, it was done like 8 months after the fact. We had journal entries. There was either no review or reviewed months after the fact. There was no segregation of duties because they didn't anticipate bringing in new staff would take so long. So they kind of operated in an emergency basis, when they probably should have adjusted their reporting structure, their segregation of duties there. And the organization was still able to run for the most part. Nothing really looked catastrophic on its own. But what we saw, I mean, their control environment became a lot weaker. And over time, it's something that there was we had lots of internal control recommendations to help them strengthen their environment, but that's the environment where fraud happens, when there's nobody checking anybody else's work, nobody working together, everything falling on one person. That person too, oftentimes they'll rationalize. It's an easy thing for them to rationalize committing fraud, because they view it as they're carrying all the weight of the organization, but they're not being paid for it. So that kind of that fraud triangle, if you will, it really comes into focus whenever situations like this happen. So what we encourage a lot of people to do, especially if there's staff shortages, is try to maintain best process controls with people that you have. So it's really kind of adding compensating controls, whether it's getting leadership involved in areas they may not have been in the past, or even the board to some degree. But it's also forcing teams to think about, outsource support, automation, some different ways to kind of tackle these problems. And, I think just one thing this has illustrated is, how fragile finance departments have become, because this organization it literally took a matter of 6 months for them going to what I would consider having a pretty strong control environment to having almost none in a very short amount of time. So it does happen and it can happen, and it's definitely an area. If I was a nonprofit leader, it would give me a lot of concern. Does anybody want to share? Do you have fewer finance staff than 2 years ago? Has there been reductions in your finance staff?
Dan, while we wait for
So that, or
individuals
also, I
to,
would even say, Justin, too, not just finance staff, even on the program side or anything else in your organization, is that would also come into play here as well.
yeah, and Dan, I was going to just chime in just from my work in working on the IT side of the nonprofit space. I mean, we've seen quite a few clients that have consolidated finance staff. They've for a number of different reasons, right? But that team has certainly dwindled down to a few employees as compared to previous years. And it looks like David had a question just regarding building financial department succession plans.
That's a great question, David. And I think that's a really good line of thought to have there. It's an area really where, it's a case by case basis. It's one where you want to get, everybody involved from your board to your HR department, your firm leadership, and you really want to nail down and get a good idea of what you already have as far as traits and skills go. And then from there, you could, really try to build that out over like a 3 to 5 year period is typically what we recommend. And then, also just to have backups in place where, in the event of unexpected or sudden departures, having potential resources you can bring in as a stopgap to, really try to mitigate any of those losses. But it's definitely a process, and I'd be happy to chat offline with you to talk about that with your specific organization at some point. So we can certainly touch base about that.
Dan, we had some other comments. It looks like Heather's fully staffed, but would prefer to have she's doing a lot more work as CFO than she would prefer.
Very common.
Cole's been able to retain his team, but it's certainly a fear, right? And Heather also mentioned in our clinic where we are short staffed, we have to turn away individuals needing treatment, which means turning away revenue.
That's very challenging because you see the need and you see that, and it's really tough to do. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. We'll touch briefly about single audits are getting tougher. We've touched on this a bit already. Really, just we talked about the increased expectations for documentation. I've been doing single audits for 15 years, and they've gotten increasingly complex over the years. You have scrutiny over the internal controls over compliance. That's an area I'd say especially over the last 4 to 5 years, that has been rising. There was a lot of fraud that came to the surface from some of the pandemic era programs. So now you kind of have the whiplash effect of, really going back and making sure that there's, appropriate scrutiny over these types of controls. You have program staff not understanding documentation requirements. That's due to a multitude of factors. Could be they're managing lots of grants. The grants themselves are changing. Compliance requirements are changing. It can be difficult to keep up with that amongst keeping up with your day job. And then CIFA and compliance tracking certainly becoming more and more complex. I see there's a note in the chat about the cost of the single audit has also increased. Yeah, we have seen that as well. I will tell you, what used to take 50 hours now takes closer to 80 hours from a single audit perspective, from an auditor perspective. So we don't enjoy that either. Um, but yes, certainly it's just the added complexities are making things a lot more difficult for everybody. What was the most difficult thing about your last single audit, if you had one? Was it responding to all the auditor requests or just keeping up with the documentation on your end? The amount of information needed, yes. Yeah, it feels endless at times. I can empathize with that. I had a client compare a single audit to a root canal. Over 70 requests for a single audit. Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, they're not the funnest thing. That is absolutely true. All right, thank you for sharing. All right, the next area, boards don't fully understand their risk. Um, we've seen this in the past. I think this has kind of been traditional practice. I think a lot of times the board thinks, oh, if the audit's completed, that just means everything is fine or okay. And if there's a clean audit opinion that, they're in a great spot. And I'll tell you from my perspective, audits are backward looking. It's looking at historical information, tells you whether the financial statements are fairly stated. It does not tell you whether the organization is exposed to any sort of operational funding fraud, cyber, or staffing risk going forward. So really, a lot of the things we're talking about that keeps leaders up at night, an audit's really not going to tell you those things, at least outright. So we see, when we talk about, we present to the board, we often see limited discussion around their reserve levels, their funding concentration, cybersecurity fraud risk, grant compliance risk. These topics, they're typically not part of the conversation. Um, Audit committees, for one reason or another, they really tend to focus on what already happened instead of really trying to ask forward-looking questions. Where from a leadership perspective, I feel like that's where they would bring the most value. Um, Really, the questions we should be asking from a board level is, what's out there that could really disrupt our operations next year? Where are we vulnerable or fragile? Are we carrying any sort of risk that maybe we're not seeing on the financial statements? And kind of what do we do about that? Um, so, what this does really, I feel like it kind of creates a disconnect between what leadership or management's experiencing from a day-to-day perspective and kind of how the board thinks that where their risk level actually is. So it's typically, it's there is a little bit of a disconnect there, just because of the different way of viewing things. Do any of these conversations come up with your board? I'd be curious to know. There's what I typically see in my from my experiences, there's usually kind of a gap between governance on the board level and then what's actually going on. Justin, you can go ahead and advance the slide. I will say on a positive note, I have worked with a lot of boards, especially lately, that have really been kind of focusing on the right details. Like obviously audits are important. It's great historical information to kind of know where you're heading. You have to know where you've been, sort of thing. But there has been, at least in some instances, I've seen some progress on more just kind of the forward-looking aspects. So that it has been positive to me, and I hope that kind of rubs off on other organizations as well. My board mostly listens to our presentations and asks minimal questions. I would say I'm probably 3 out of 4 boards, Heather, from my experience, are kind of the same, especially when we're presenting an audit. Um, they kind of sit through the presentation. They ask, we might get a question, were there any issues, or did we have a good year? That's about it, the bulk of what we typically get. Sometimes we get a little bit more, but yeah, it's typically kind of a lack of participation, I would call it. All right, so the last area is cash flow issues. So we have money, but cash flow is a bit of a mess. We see this especially in organizations that have a heavy reliance on reimbursement-based grants. We have aging government receivables. So yeah, this is an interesting one because usually if you had a receivable from the government, you could basically have a high degree of confidence that you were going to get that money. And one thing that we've seen, especially 2025, even into this year, is it's not often the case. Sometimes they can sit out there for a very long time, or there's been instances of organizations that have had put out programmatic funds for operations, for salaries, et cetera, for a grant program that was canceled or paused. And that created quite a bit of a constraint for the organization. Um, but I would say in general that reimbursements themselves have been getting slower, not faster. There's been staffing shortages at a lot of the government agencies as well, so that's kind of resulting in longer processing times. Or the people that work at the government agency, they may not have the level of experience that they used to. It takes them a longer time to process these requests. So what this has done to the nonprofits or people that administer these grants has definitely had a pretty big impact on their cash flow. What we've seen, a lot of organizations, they kind of operate in a week to week, month to month capacity, even day to day in some instances. So there's really a lack of like a formal cash flow forecast, if you will, where I think that would, we're seeing organizations being forced to rely on line of credits or just really, cut things pretty close or holding vendor payments, things like that. And this could even be in an organization that, if you looked at it from an audit perspective, have pretty healthy financial statements. This has unfortunately become pretty common, but it's an area where if you're, especially in finance leadership, I mean, this is an area of pressure that's not fun to face, and it's become pretty prevalent over the last couple of years. So I'd be curious, anybody on the webinar, do you forecast your cash flow beyond just your annual budget? Is that something that comes up, or is that an area that you don't have a formal process for?
Dan, it looks like Heather mentioned that they do not, and Cole does 13-week rolling cash flow forecast.
That's good to hear. 13 week rolling cash flow forecast. That's very good. Excellent. I'm glad to hear that. Has anybody experienced any cash flow crunches? See definite cash crunches. Looks like Paul, they do a 10-year cash flow analysis for major expenditures. That's good to hear. I had an organization I worked with in New Jersey that their model was set up. They basically they're, for lack of a better term, they're just a large pass-through entity. They administer a lot of federal and state grants. Um, Probably about 92% of their funding, something like that. And the government shutdown, just for lack of a better term, really just crippled their operations because they had a lot of reimbursable grants. And it was tough to see. They had to lay some people off. They had to, it was a challenge just to keep the lights on for them. And that was really just kind of due to their model. And as a result of that, they've really had to kind of reevaluate their entire operating um, setup, if you will, to make sure that they're able to continue providing the services they do. And a lot of it was just due to the cash flow crunch because they had a lot of reimbursable grants that were out there. Um, so it can be a challenge, and it's definitely frustrating.
Yeah, Dan Cole had mentioned just waiting in between program funding, county, state, school district funding, right?
Absolutely. Yep. It takes a long time to go through all the channels for sure, and it can be a challenge. We'll talk a little bit about just some of the hidden risks that are out there. I think we sort of started to touch on this throughout the webinar here, but there's kind of where these issues start to come together. So you have your funding concentration. This is where this happens to some nonprofits more than others. You appear to be financially healthy, but in reality, it's highly fragile. This can be due to heavy reliance on either one grant, one donor, or a group of donors, or a government funding source. So financial statements, like kind of like we talked about, they're not always going to reveal this exposure. And it's definitely an area I would say that's of hidden risk, where if something were to happen to that grant or that funding stream, what would you do from an organizational perspective, or even how long could you operate? So to put that out to the group here, if your largest revenue source were to disappear or pause, um, how would you approach that, or how long could you operate? What we've seen, we've started to ask this question to boards whenever we do our presentation, just to get them thinking along these lines. And for most organizations, the answer is kind of uncomfortable, and often they've really not thought about it in these terms. It's not that they're doing anything wrong, or anybody is doing anything wrong. It's just really it's trying to understand where the organization is most fragile. And what that does, it kind of reframes it to where, okay, now we understand this, we can plan around it. Um, we can have a plan in place so that we're not forced to make reactive decisions down the line. David, it looks like, okay, we have Medicaid reserves to last 6 months. That's a lot better than some of the conversations we've had. But thank you for sharing that. So what we've done, we've been working with a lot of nonprofits over the last several months with a tool that we've come up. It's a funding diversity and resilience assessment from HBK. So really what it is, it's a tool that was developed to help nonprofit leaders understand risk exposure that's out there that they probably traditionally wouldn't be aware of. So it's not an audit exercise. It's more of a resilience exercise. So what this really aims to do is to evaluate potential funding concentration, like we talked about, any sort of dependency on not just grants, but any specific sources of revenue, and timing risk that's out there. So this will help the board really assess their reserves in terms of are they truly sufficient for our operations, and just provide awareness of any potential areas of fragility that are out there. So, the thing that we've seen when we've walked through this with a couple organizations, there's been kind of a few like aha moments where the light kind of came on, where they realize, hey, maybe we are a little more dependent on this area than we realized. And or we've also seen some instances where, hey, we're doing pretty good. We were considering pursuing a different avenue or a new program. It looks like that we do have the wherewithal to withstand this. It really just kind of provides a different lens to look through this financial information through. So what this looks like from our perspective and kind of what what you would get from this process. So in year one, we would do a full assessment. It would provide a baseline, if you will. We would recommend annual updates to track those changes over time that will keep leadership boards informed as your funding structure evolves. So how we typically deliver this, there's a financial resilience summary report, shows your revenue mix, an analysis of any concentration that you have, restriction risk, and resilience metrics. So we've developed a dashboard with nice traffic light indicators, either red, yellow, or green, and an overall resilience rating. And that's compared against different nonprofits across the industry that we've standardized that through. And then also at the end of it, we do a board presentation that walks through our findings and presents key questions, kind of like we were talking about previously, for the board or the organization's consideration. So what we're seeing through this assessment, we've seen a lot of organizations that believe they're diversified and they have lots of funding sources, when in reality they're actually not. We've seen organizations really be able to pinpoint some of their cash flow challenges directly to kind of their funding mix, and they've been able to come up with a better approach to managing their cash. Oftentimes boards are unaware of some of the risks that are out there, especially concentration risks. And what we've also seen is that nonprofits are oftentimes one delayed grant away from a crisis, kind of like the example I gave, where they had about 90% of their funds through grants, and there was a pause, and it actually was unfortunately kind of a crisis for them. So really, I think at the end of the day, the thing that provides the most value for an assessment like these is really just having the information and being able to make forward-looking decisions, or have a plan in place so that you're not making a reactive decision in a tough spot. It's really just coming up with plans for risks that are probably more prevalent than people realize, but aren't often talked about. Has anybody thought about um, taking a look at their revenue in this sort of manner, or did these conversations come up as part of your strategic planning or board conversations or anything of that sort? Is there any other, I'd be curious too, is there any other challenges out there that you're seeing that we didn't touch on today? Like I indicated at the beginning, trying to whittle this down to 6 challenges was a bit challenging in and of itself. There's a lot of challenges facing nonprofits out there. So if there's something specific to your organization, I'd be curious to know about that as well.
Yeah, and Dan, I see that we are here at the top of the hour. So again, just I guess a quick recap here on how Vertilocity and HBK support nonprofit leaders, right? Audit, advisory, internal controls, funding resilience, cybersecurity, IT, board governance and training. A lot of what we've recapped here today. But just being cognizant of everybody's time commitment here, we'll get to the last slide. We've got Dan's information here. If anybody has any further questions or wants to, discuss additional topics that maybe weren't covered today, or just bounce some ideas, right? Dan's a resource for you guys. I'm certainly a resource for anybody on the Vertilocity that has IT or security questions. But we really appreciate everybody's time. And Dan, I mean, I'm happy to hang on for a couple more minutes if anybody has some specific questions they want to go over. It looks like David just dropped something into the chat, so we can hang on for a few minutes and chat. But if people have to jump, please don't hesitate to reach out if we can be of any assistance.
Absolutely. I can hang on for a few minutes as well, but if there's something you want to have a follow-up conversation on, I would love to do that in the future. So please don't hesitate to reach out to either myself or Justin.
And it looked like David had dropped in transportation grants were unavailable in 25, 26. West Virginia didn't sign purchase agreements for 26 vehicles.
Sounds like some more fun things thrown at us from the government.
All right, Dan, I don't believe we have any other questions that have come through. So again, appreciate everybody's time. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and please don't hesitate to reach out if we can be of assistance. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us. Take care, everyone.